In the first part, we ended with the category trees. And the second part of the categories, Aristotle changes his method of dividing things, and he has a fourfold division. And here, Aristotle is considering our use of language, in particular predication. And he notes that some things are said of a subject, while other things are said in a subject. Some are both, and finally, some are neither said of or in a subject. Now, that is probably a little confusing at this point, so let's try to sort these things out. These indicate where something lies on an ontological map, and we need to talk about predication in order to be a little bit more clear about this. Okay, so predication. Just quick review, a subject is what a statement is about, and a predicate is what a statement says about its subject, okay? That's the general idea of what predication is. So we have a sentence, simple sentence, Paul writes, or Socrates is a human, or humans are animals. So we have Paul would be the subject of the first sentence, and writes would be the predicate. Is a human would be the predicate of the second sentence, and are animals would be the predicate of the third sentence. Now, the same thing could be both a subject and a predicate. So we have our example here in human. In the second sentence, Socrates is a human, the term human is a predicate. But in the third sentence, humans, that term there is serving as the subject. And some things are subjects, though, but are never predicates. For example, Socrates. You don't use Socrates as a predicate. This particular color is a subject. So Socrates as a human being tells us something fundamental about what kind of thing Socrates is. This is an essential predication. So that's going to be one type of predication. Socrates is wise tells us something less fundamental. It tells us of a feature that a thing has, but could possibly lack. Socrates may have had dementia at the end of his life. Now, as a matter of fact, he did not. He was very clear thinking right up to the moment he drank the hemlock. But it's some feature that he could have possibly lacked, so that we call that an accidental predication. So that's a different kind of predication. So for Aristotle, when he uses this phrase, to be said of a subject, he intends that to identify the kind of thing it is. So that's what's going on in the sentence, Socrates is a human. We're identifying the kind of thing that Socrates is. When something is said in a subject, that identifies a characteristic that is in the subject, but it could lack it. It identifies how something is. So now we have this fourfold division of ontology based on our language, whether it could be a predicate at all, whether it's said of a subject, whether it's said in a subject, or whether it's both, right? So I've created this extensive chart. If you're taking my course, you have this as a handout. If you're not taking the course, this may be too small to see, but if you can zoom in on the upper left-hand quadrant, you can see that we're dividing in this chart substances from non-substances and universals from individuals. And we put that essential predication in that upper left hand of the chart. Examples of this would be man, horse, animal. It's a fundamental ontological classification of something. If X is said of Y, and then that means that the definition of X applies to Y. So if man is said of Socrates, then the definition man applies to Socrates. This says what it is. It says something that's essential in it. And note that it does not come in degrees. Now, moving to our lower right-hand quadrant, something that is not said of a subject, but is said in a subject. So these are predicates that are accidental. This is a relation of ontological dependence. and it says how a thing is. So what's in the subject could be accidental, it could be some other way, and this could come in degrees. So we might say somebody is wise as our example, and the wisdom in that case depends on that individual person, let's say Socrates, and the wisdom could come in degrees, right? You could be somewhat wise, very wise, etc. So it's unlike being said of in that sense. And above that right-hand lower quadrant, we have the upper right-hand quadrant, things that are said of a subject and also in a subject. Now, I don't think Aristotle intended these to be done at the same time. So we had our example of human that seemed to be able to identify both. Well, let's use, for example, knowledge. It could be said of grammar. So someone has a particular knowledge of grammar. It can be said the knowledge is grammar. It's essential to that knowledge that it's of grammar. Or somebody could have knowledge in their soul. So we might say somebody has knowledge. You could say the same thing of white. Of a color, it's essential. You could say it's in a horse, though, where it's accidental that that horse is white. So those are universal non-substances. Now, we've not talked yet about the lower left-hand quadrant. These are things not said of a subject and not said in a subject. These are individual, particular things. So that particular horse or that particular person, Callias, these are primary substances. They're never used as predicates. They can undergo change. And note that all the other three areas of predication ultimately depend on a subject, an individual person. So this is extremely important for Aristotle in identifying fundamental things that exist. Okay, that was quick. If you need to go back and look at that chart a little bit more carefully, obviously feel free to do so. So we have, though, that's driving this chart, a principle of ontological dependence. If they didn't exist, it'd be impossible for any of the other things that exist. And we saw that that was the case for the individual substances on our prior chart. So Aristotle's argument for the ontological priority of primary substances goes something like this. Every universal, which is a secondary substance, the ones from the upper left-hand quadrant, is predicated of, that is said of, some primary substance. So that would be like human. Socrates is human. That's a universal. It's predicated of a primary substance. Every individual or particular non-substance is going to be predicated of some primary substance as well. So these are things that are said in something, the lower right-hand quadrant of our chart. Now we also have every universal non-substance at all. These are either said of a universal substance or said in some primary substance. These are the ones in the upper right-hand quadrant. They're predicated of something, right? They're either predicated of the universals in the upper left-hand quadrant, or they're predicated of a individual characteristic in the lower right-hand quadrant, or they are predicated directly of substances. And then finally, everything other than primary substances is either said of or said in a primary substance, or said of a predicate that in turn is said of a primary substance. So because of those characteristics, we've identified of the three first quadrants that we discussed, if primary substances didn't exist, neither would anything else. We have to have that lower left-hand quadrant, the individual primary substances. Everything else depends on them. So those are the primary substances that exist. Primary substances, in other words, have ontological priority. So what are substances? Substances have no contraries themselves, unlike some of the other characteristics we talked about, other predicates. Substances are the subjects that persist through change. So Socrates could be cold and then hot. And just to have a quotation here from the categories 4A at 10, most characteristic of substance seems to be the fact that something one and the same in number can receive contraries. So that's where Aristotle concludes the quest for primary substances in the categories. Things are going to get a little bit more complex when we discuss a problem that Aristotle identifies, and we go on into the book called the Physics and the book called the Metaphysics.